It's now been over a year since Apple revealed the M1 iMac at their spring event, and it's been extremely useful to us in our office since our main editor Angelica has been editing basically every single video that you've seen come up on our channel over the past year with the 24-inch iMac. But now, we've recently started to get a flood of leaks for the upcoming M2 Max that we're all expecting to get sometime this year, and unfortunately, the 24-inch iMac has been missing from those leaks. But over the past few days, we finally got some major leak and rumor confirmation of what all of us feared. It looks like there will be no 24-inch M2 iMac, and Apple is instead going to be holding off until the M3 chip is ready to update this iMac again. So in this video, I'm going to be going through all of those leaks and putting all the little puzzle pieces together to try to find out why Apple would do this, as well as which features we should expect and how much performance we should expect as well. And finally, I'm gonna answer a couple of the most important questions. When is it expected to actually launch? And should you wait for it compared to just buying the current M1 iMac right now? And before I get into all those leaks, I've gotta share our experience with the 24-inch M1 iMac over the past year. Like I said before, our editor Angelica has been using it full time to edit almost all of our YouTube videos, and she's been absolutely loving it. And that's pretty impressive because she used to edit on a 27-inch iMac from 2020, which was almost 2 times more expensive than this new M1 iMac. In fact, she likes it so much that she even said that she wishes she had this iMac at her house. And she said she's gotten used to the smaller display size and has no issues at all. And she especially loves how much more snappy the M1 chip is compared to the old Intel chips. So with all that said, it should give us some perspective in terms of the future 24-inch iMac update, because if this current M1 model can already satisfy the editing needs of a YouTube channel like ours, which tries to post 6 videos per week, it should be enough for the vast majority of people. But now, let's finally jump into the leaks and rumors with a huge report from Mark Gurman, who is the most reliable Apple analyst out there. This past Sunday, he talked about what we should expect for the next upcoming Macs, including a bunch of M2-based Macs like the MacBook Air, the Mac Mini, MacBook Pros, and even the Mac Pro. But in terms of the iMac, he said that he heard about an M3 version of that desktop being already in the works, though he imagines it won't launch until the end of next year at the earliest. And this leak is actually a huge deal because it perfectly matches up to information from another source, Leaks Apple Pro. He says that his sources expect a bunch of M3 Macs coming late 2023, including a new M3 Mac Mini, a MacBook Air, and a MacBook Pro, and that is actually exactly when I'm personally expecting the very first M3 Macs to launch, late 2023. And the reason for that is because the M3 chip is rumored to be based on TSMC's 3nm chip process, and DigiTimes recently reported that TSMC will begin production of 3nm chips in the last quarter of 2022, with Apple actually launching 3nm based products in 2023, like the M3 chip and the A17 chip for iPhones. But even before that, we were getting reports back in November about 3nm Mac and iPhone chips coming as soon as 2023, and we recently got another report from DigiTimes that TSMC is on track to begin 3nm chip production in the second half of this year. But as far as the M3 iMac, Leaks Apple Pro actually said that it'll launch in early 2024, a few months after the first M3 Max launch in the fall quarter of 2023. And that actually makes perfect sense to me because that's exactly what Apple did with the first M1 Max. They launched 3 of them in November of 2020, and then they waited about half a year until launching the M1 iMac. So I think there's a good chance they're going to be doing that again. But now let's finally answer the big question. Why in the world would Apple skip the M2 iMac and wait that long until refreshing it again with the M3 chip? Well, I think the main reason is because almost every M2 Mac is expected to come with a total redesign, except the iMac. For example, we're expecting a full redesign for the M2 Mac Mini, becoming a lot thinner than before, showing how powerful Apple Silicon truly is. Then we also have the M2 MacBook Air, which will also be getting a full redesign with a new thin chassis, new color options, MagSafe 3, and a new display with white bezels and probably a notch. And the only other machine left would be the base M2 MacBook Pro, which is by far the most confusing because apparently this one is not going to be getting a full redesign. But who knows, maybe it'll take on the 14-inch MacBook Pro redesign. We really don't know just yet. But the point that I'm making is that what if the M2 chip isn't going to be enough of a deal by itself to justify a new product refresh? So Apple is combining the M2 chip with a redesign to make the new M2 Max look like a great upgrade. But now let's move our focus over to the 24-inch iMac and why Apple would skip the M2 chip refresh and wait for the M3 chip. Well, of course, this is the only M1 Mac that actually received a full redesign last year. And since it already has its redesign, what if giving it the M2 chip wouldn't be enough of an upgrade to make it worth it in the eyes of consumers and especially YouTubers who are going to be reviewing it like us? And I can tell you right now, the M2 chip alone isn't going to be enough to make it worth upgrading from the M1 24-inch iMac to a new M2 model unless Apple packs in a bunch of other new features. And that's because I honestly don't think the M2 chip is going to be that big of an upgrade, seeing as I still believe it's going to be slower than the 14-inch MacBook Pro's M1 Pro chip. So if you're wondering how the M2 chip will compare, here is a chart of the single-core performance considering two different scenarios, with the M2 chip based on either the A15 or future A16 chip cores. And as you can see, the single-core performance is where you'll see the biggest advantage for things like web browsing. However, in terms of multi-core, the performance is still lacking compared to the M1 Pro chip, and that's mainly because the M2 is expected to keep the same 8-core CPU layout as the M1 already has, 4 efficiency cores and 4 performance cores. Now in terms of graphics performance, that's where we'll likely see a nice boost because the cores will not only be getting faster, but Apple will be adding 2 more GPU cores to the M2 chip. But yet again, we're still expecting the graphics performance to also lag behind the M1 Pro chip. So with that said, it kind of makes sense why Apple would wait for the M3 chip, because that would finally be a big enough performance and feature jump to make it worth upgrading to that new M3 24-inch iMac, because I fully believe that the M3 chip will outperform the M1 Pro in every way. And the reason I believe this is because the M3 chip is reportedly going to be based on TSMC's brand new 3nm technology, which should have a pretty huge leap over the current 5nm technology, which is used in the M1 chip, the A15 chip, and likely the new A16 chip going into the upcoming iPhone 14 models, which would technically be called TSMC's N4P process, which makes it sound like 4nm, but in reality, TSMC themselves confirmed that it's actually 5nm+++. So going from that to true 3nm will be a huge jump in performance per watt, and it would allow the M3 chip to get a lot more powerful without requiring better cooling solutions. Now on top of that, Leaks Apple Pro gave us some exclusive information concerning the chip layout we should be expecting for the M3 chip. Apparently, Apple has 2 prototypes of the M3, one with an 8-core CPU which is unchanged from the M1 and M2, and then the other prototype has a 10-core CPU adding 2 more performance cores. And this actually matches up to my own personal expectations because it makes sense for Apple to add more cores as they switch to better process nodes from TSMC, because the cores have improved performance per watt, allowing them to run cooler than before, so Apple can balance it out by adding more cores. Now, Leaks Apple Pro actually suggests that Apple could use both prototypes, with the lower-end 8-core CPU version going into the MacBook Air and the 10-core going into the base MacBook Pro, finally making a difference in performance between both Macs. And in my opinion, I fully expect both of these prototype M3 chips to outperform the current M1 Pro chip because of the 3nm enhancements. And that's exactly why I think Apple is waiting until the M3 chip is ready to refresh the iMac again. Especially if Apple actually adds Face ID to the iMac, which they considered doing for the M1 iMac, but they ended up holding off. So with all that said, I think the M3 iMac is going to be a great upgrade, but because it might not launch until 2024, I think most people should honestly just buy the current M1 iMac right now or wait for the new M2 Max coming later this year. Now, if you disagree with me, go ahead and let me know down in the comment section below. But if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and click the circle above to subscribe for more videos like this one, and definitely check out one of those two right over there. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.